A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Herman, I was looking at the grocery receipt the other day, and then I looked at the official inflation numbers, and the two things just do not seem to live in the same universe. It feels like there is this massive gap between what we are told the economy is doing and what we actually feel when we are standing at the checkout counter. It is like being told it is a sunny 70-degree day while you are currently standing in a freezing downpour.
It is the great disconnect of modern life, corn. And it is funny you bring that up because our housemate Daniel actually sent us a prompt about this very thing. He was asking about the statistical rigor, or maybe the lack thereof, behind the whole basket of goods methodology. You know, that hypothetical collection of stuff that the government uses to tell us how much our lives cost. It is a concept that sounds simple on paper but becomes incredibly murky once you start looking at the actual math.
It is a fascinating prompt because the Consumer Price Index, or the CPI, is probably the most influential economic fiction in our society. We treat it like a hard physical constant, like the speed of light or the boiling point of water. But when you pull back the curtain, it is much more of a statistical construct, almost an artistic rendering of an economy, rather than a literal map. We are talking about a single number that dictates the movement of trillions of dollars.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have to say, calling it an artistic rendering is being generous. To many people, it feels more like creative accounting. But we should be clear from the jump that even though it feels personal, the Consumer Price Index is not actually a cost of living index. The Bureau of Labor Statistics is very careful about that distinction. It is a price index for a fixed basket of goods, but because we use it to calculate things like Social Security increases, tax brackets, and even interest rates, it becomes the de facto measure of our reality. It is the yardstick we use to measure the value of our time and labor.
Right, and that is the core of the problem. If that single percentage point shift in the CPI happens, it triggers a multi-billion-dollar fiscal cascade. It changes how much the government pays out in benefits, how much it takes in through tax brackets that shift with inflation, and how much your mortgage might cost if you have a variable rate. It is the invisible hand that moves the goalposts of the American dream. So, today, we are going into the belly of the beast. We are going to look at the mechanics of this basket, the biases baked into the math, and whether a single number can ever actually represent the economic reality of 340 million different people.
It is a massive task. And look, the methodology has evolved. For a long time, the Bureau of Labor Statistics updated the weights of what is in the basket every 2 years. But as of 2023, they shifted to an annual update. They are trying to be more responsive to how we actually spend money. But even with annual updates, the math often struggles to keep up with how fast the world moves. We are living in 2026, an era where consumer habits can shift in a weekend thanks to a viral trend or a supply chain hiccup, yet our primary economic sensor is still calibrated on a yearly cycle.
Well, let us start with the math then. Because one of the things that always bugs people when they hear that inflation is, say, 3%, but their eggs are up 20%, is this concept of weighting. Can you walk us through how they actually decide what matters more in the basket? Because if the basket is wrong, the whole calculation is just a sophisticated guess.
Sure. Think of the basket as a giant pie chart. Not every item is equal. If the price of yachts goes up 10%, most people do not care. But if the price of rent or gasoline goes up 10%, the whole country feels it. So, they assign weights based on consumer expenditure surveys. Currently, the single biggest slice of that pie is shelter. It accounts for approximately 35% of the total consumer price index weight. After that, you have things like food and beverages, transportation, medical care, and education.
35% for shelter. That seems like a lot, but for many people in cities like Jerusalem where we are, or in places like New York or London, rent is way more than 35% of their income. If you are spending 50% of your paycheck on a roof over your head, and the index only weights it at 35, The index is already undercounting your personal experience of inflation, right? It is essentially telling you that your biggest expense matters less than it actually does.
And that is the first major bias. It is a weighted average of the whole population. It includes people who own their homes outright and have no mortgage, and it includes people who are struggling to pay rent every month. It averages them out. So the number it spits out represents the average experience, which literally no individual person actually has. It is a statistical ghost. It is like saying the average human has one ovary and one testicle. It is mathematically correct based on the population, but it describes almost no one accurately.
And it is not just about the weights. It is about how they actually measure the prices. I remember we talked about the global supply chain back in episode 661, and how shocks there can change prices overnight. But the government's data collection seems slower. Are they still sending people out with clipboards to check the price of a gallon of milk in the middle of a digital revolution?
They actually still do some of that, believe it or not. They have economic data assistants who visit thousands of retail stores and service establishments, but they have modernized quite a bit. They use a lot more web scraping now, and they use scanner data from retailers. So when you scan your loyalty card at the grocery store, that data eventually finds its way into the statistical models. But even with faster data, there is a massive lag in certain categories, especially shelter. And this is where the rigor starts to look a bit more like guesswork.
Wait, why is there a lag in shelter? Rent is something people pay every single month. You would think that would be the easiest thing to track in real time. We have apps that track apartment listings by the hour. Why is the government behind?
You would think, but the way they calculate it is actually quite strange. They use something called owner's equivalent rent for people who own homes. They basically ask homeowners, if you were to rent out your home today, how much do you think it would rent for? It is a subjective estimate. Think about that, Corn. A huge chunk of the most important economic metric in the world is based on homeowners guessing what their house is worth on the rental market. And for actual renters, they track existing leases. But most people only sign a new lease once a year. So if market rents spike in January, it might not show up fully in the consumer price index for 6 to 12 months, because it takes that long for all the old leases to expire and the new, higher prices to be captured by the survey.
That is a huge deal. That means when the central banks are looking at inflation data to decide on interest rates, as we discussed in episode 518, they are looking at a rearview mirror. They are making decisions today based on rent hikes that happened nearly a year ago. If they are trying to cool down an economy that has already cooled, they are basically slamming on the brakes after the car has already stopped.
Precisely. And that lag can lead to policy errors. If inflation is actually cooling down, but the shelter component is still reflecting last year's heat, the central bank might keep interest rates too high for too long, potentially causing a recession. It is a very blunt instrument for such a delicate operation. It is like trying to perform surgery with a hatchet while wearing a blindfold that shows you what happened 10 minutes ago.
Okay, so we have the waiting problem and the lag problem. But then there is the stuff that feels like actual magic tricks. I am talking about hedonic quality adjustment. This is the one that always makes my head spin. Can you explain why the government might say a $500 smartphone is actually cheaper than the $400 smartphone you bought 3 years ago? Because to my bank account, $500 is definitely more than $400.
This is where people start to feel like the numbers are being manipulated. Hedonic adjustment is the process of stripping out price increases that are due to improvements in quality. The theory is that if you buy a new car this year and it costs $2,000 more than last year's model, but it also has better fuel efficiency, more airbags, and a better navigation system, you are getting more utility for your money. So, the statisticians at the Bureau of Labor Statistics will say the price did not actually go up by $2,000. They might say it only went up by $500 because the other $1,500 bought you a better product.
But I cannot pay my rent with better fuel efficiency. If I only have $30,000 to spend on a car, and the cheapest car is now $32,000, I am still priced out of the market, regardless of how many extra airbags it has. It feels like this method measures the value of the technology rather than the burden on the consumer's wallet. It is a measure of stuff per dollar rather than dollars needed to survive.
That is the perfect way to put it. It measures utility, not affordability. From a purely scientific perspective, it makes sense. If you are trying to measure the value of the currency, you want to know what that currency buys you in terms of quality. If a dollar buys a faster computer today than it did yesterday, the dollar is technically more powerful in that specific sector. But if you are a person trying to survive on a fixed budget, hedonic adjustments feel like a gaslighting tactic. They do this with everything from computers to washing machines to televisions. It is why the price of electronics in the inflation reports always seems to be crashing, even if the price you pay at the store stays the same or goes up. The tech is getting so much better so fast that the quality adjusted price is plummeting.
It creates this weird situation where the official data says we are living in an era of incredible abundance because our screens are sharper and our processors are faster, while people feel poorer because the things they actually need to survive, like food and energy, do not really get hedonic adjustments. You cannot really say this apple is 20% better than last year's apple because it has more vitamins, can you? An apple is an apple.
Actually, they do not really do it for food, which is why food and energy are often the most painful parts of the index. And that leads us to the next big controversy, substitution bias. The idea here is that consumers are rational actors. If the price of steak goes up by 50%, the government assumes you are not just going to keep buying steak and complain about it. They assume you will switch to chicken.
And so they change the basket to reflect that. They just decide, I am a chicken person now.
Not exactly. They use a formula called the geometric mean, which mathematically accounts for the fact that as things get more expensive, people buy less of them and move toward cheaper alternatives. It is called the Chained Consumer Price Index. The logic is that it more accurately reflects how people actually behave. If the price of oranges spikes, you buy apples. The statisticians argue that if they did not account for this, they would be overstating inflation because they would be assuming you are still buying the expensive oranges. But the criticism is obvious. If you are forced to switch from steak to chicken because you can no longer afford steak, your standard of living has decreased. But the inflation index might show a lower number because it says, hey, you are still eating protein and chicken is cheap.
It feels like a race to the bottom. If we keep substituting down until we are all eating lentils and riding bicycles because we cannot afford gas or meat, the inflation index could look very stable while our actual quality of life is cratering. It ignores the preference of the consumer. I do not want chicken. I want the steak I used to be able to afford. By ignoring that loss of utility, the index feels like it is cheating. It is measuring the cost of a calorie rather than the cost of a lifestyle.
It is a fundamental philosophical divide. Is the goal to measure the cost of maintaining a specific, static lifestyle? Or is the goal to measure the cost of staying alive and functional in the current economy? Most people want the first one, but the government tends to measure the second one. And when you realize that these numbers are used to calculate the cost of living adjustments, or COLAs, for Social Security recipients, you see the real-world impact. If the index undercounts the true cost of maintaining a lifestyle because it assumes people will just buy cheaper stuff, then seniors on Social Security are effectively getting a stealth cut in their purchasing power every single year. Over 20 years, that substitution adds up to a massive decline in what that check can actually buy.
That is a heavy thought, and it brings up the political side of this. We try to stick to the facts here, but you cannot ignore the incentives. Governments are the largest debtors in the history of the world. Inflation is actually a friend to a debtor because it lets you pay back your loans with cheaper dollars. But at the same time, the government has to pay out benefits indexed to inflation. So, they have a very strong incentive to make sure the official inflation number stays as low as possible. If they can tweak the math to shave off 0.5%, they save billions.
It is a massive conflict of interest. If you can change the methodology to shave 0.5% off the consumer price index every year, you save billions of dollars in interest payments on inflation-protected bonds and benefit payouts. Over a decade, that is trillions of dollars. Now, the statisticians at the Bureau of Labor Statistics will tell you they are just following the best peer-reviewed science. And to be fair, the changes they have made over the years, like moving to the geometric mean or adding hedonic adjustments, are supported by many mainstream economists. But from a skeptical perspective, there is a deep distrust of any system where the person who owes the money also gets to define the value of the currency.
Right. It is like the old saying about the fox guarding the henhouse. But even if we assume everyone is acting in good faith, the sheer diversity of the population makes a single number almost useless. I mean, think about the difference between a 22-year-old graduate student in a tiny apartment and a 75-year-old retiree in a suburban home. Their baskets look nothing alike. One is buying textbooks and cheap beer. The other is buying heart medication and property taxes.
They really do not. The retiree is likely spending a huge portion of their income on healthcare. Healthcare costs have historically risen much faster than the general inflation rate. Meanwhile, the graduate student might be spending more on education and technology, which, as we discussed, often have those downward hedonic adjustments. So the student might feel like things are getting better or at least staying flat, while the retiree feels like they are drowning. There is actually an experimental index called the Consumer Price Index for the Elderly, or the CPIE, which tries to account for this. It weights healthcare much more heavily. And unsurprisingly, it almost always shows a higher rate of inflation than the standard index.
So why do we not use that for Social Security? If we have a more accurate tool for that specific demographic, why is it still experimental after all these years?
Because it would cost more money, corn. It always comes back to the budget. If you use a more accurate index that shows higher inflation for seniors, the government has to write bigger checks. And in an era of massive deficits, that is a hard sell for any politician, regardless of their party. It is easier to stick with the average, even if the average is a lie for the people it is supposed to help.
It is amazing how much of our global financial architecture is built on these shaky foundations. We mention the US system a lot because it is the world's reserve currency. But how do other countries handle this? Does everyone use the same basket? Or is everyone just making up their own rules for the game?
Not at all. There's a lot of variation. In Europe, they use the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices, or the HICP. One of the biggest differences between the European model and the American model is how they treat housing. The European index generally excludes the cost of owner-occupied housing. They focus more on the actual monetary transactions. So if you own your home, your housing costs are mostly invisible to their main inflation index. They argue that a house is an asset, not a consumable good.
That seems even crazier. How can you have a cost of living measure that ignores the biggest cost most people have? If house prices double, but you do not count it because it is an asset, you are missing the entire story of why the younger generation feels broke.
Their argument is that you do not eat your house. You live in it while its value hopefully goes up. So they view buying a house as an investment rather than a cost. But of course, that does not help the person who is trying to figure out why they have no money left at the end of the month. It just goes to show that there is no universal, objective way to do this. Every country makes different trade-offs between statistical purity and real-world relevance. The U.S. includes owner's equivalent rent to try and capture the value of the shelter service, while Europe ignores it to keep the index focused on pure transactions. Both methods are flawed in their own way.
And then there is the distinction between headline inflation and core inflation. This is another one that drives people nuts. You will see a news report saying inflation is cooling down, but then you look at the fine print and it says core inflation, which excludes food and energy. As the joke goes, core inflation is inflation for people who do not eat or drive. It feels like the ultimate ignore the man behind the curtain move.
It sounds like a conspiracy to hide the truth, but there is a statistical reason for it. Food and energy prices are incredibly volatile. They are pushed around by global events, weather, and geopolitical tensions. If a hurricane hits the Gulf of Mexico, gas prices might spike for a month and then drop back down. If the central bank changed interest rates every time the price of gas moved, the economy would be a roller coaster. So they use core inflation to see the underlying trend, the stuff that is more stable and influenced by actual domestic monetary policy.
I get the logic, I really do. You want to filter out the noise. But for the average person, the noise is the most important part. You cannot ignore the price of bread and gasoline just because it is volatile. That is the stuff that actually determines whether you can pay your bills this week. When the experts talk about core inflation, they are speaking a different language than the people living in the economy. It is like a doctor telling you your core. Health is great, but ignoring the fact that your arm is currently on fire.
It is a disconnect in communication. The experts are trying to manage the machinery of the macroeconomy. They are looking at the latte factor, the small discretionary things versus the massive structural costs like housing and energy. The consumer price index is being forced to serve both masters, and it is not doing a great job at either. It is too slow for the policymakers and too broad for the individuals.
So, where does this go from here? We are in 2026 now. We have more data than ever. We have artificial intelligence that can process billions of transactions in real time. We have blockchain ledgers that could theoretically track every cent spent. Are we getting closer to a system that actually reflects reality? Or are we just getting better at building more complex fictions?
There is a lot of exciting work being done in what is called high-frequency inflation tracking. There are projects like the Billion Prices Project at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which scrapes millions of prices from online retailers every single day. They can show inflation trends in near real time without the month-long lag of the government reports. And the beauty of that kind of data is that it can be disaggregated.
Disaggregated, meaning we could finally move away from the one-size-fits-all basket, meaning we could have a personal inflation rate.
Imagine an app on your phone that connects to your bank account and looks at what you actually buy. It could tell you, based on your specific spending habits, that your personal inflation rate is 6%, even if the national average is only 3%. That would be a game changer for personal finance. It would let people make much more informed decisions about their careers, their investments, and their savings. You would finally know if you are actually getting a raise in real terms, or if your boss is just giving you a cost of living adjustment that does not actually cover your cost of living.
That sounds incredibly useful, but also a bit terrifying. If everyone has their own personal inflation rate, does that break the social contract? Part of the reason the Consumer Price Index works as a policy tool is that we all agree to pretend it is the truth. It is a shared reality. If we all have our own truths, how do we decide on things like wage increases or pension adjustments? Does the economy just fragment into 300 million different versions of reality?
That is the big question. It goes back to what we discussed in episode 867 about the challenges of measuring a living practice like democracy or an economy. If you move away from a single shared metric, you lose the ability to have a unified national policy. But if the single metric is fundamentally flawed and people stop believing in it, you lose the social contract anyway. We are already seeing that. There is a massive trust gap. People do not believe the official numbers because their eyes and their wallets are telling them something else. When the gap between the official truth and the felt truth gets too wide, the institutions start to crumble.
It is a crisis of institutional credibility, and it is not just about the math. It is about the fact that the math is being used to justify policies that feel like they are hurting the average person. When the central bank says they need to keep interest rates high to fight inflation, but the inflation they are fighting is partly a lag in rent data from a year ago, people get rightfully angry. They are paying the price for a ghost in the machine.
And it is worth noting that the methodology itself has become a political football. There are constant debates about whether we should move to a different type of index, like the Chained Consumer Price Index, for all government programs. Some people see that as a way to make the numbers more accurate. Others see it as a way to sneakily cut benefits. It is never just about the science. It is about who wins and who loses when the decimal point moves.
So, if you are a listener out there and you are feeling that squeeze, what is the takeaway? Beyond just knowing that the system is a bit of a statistical ghost, is there anything practical people can do? How do we navigate an economy where the primary compass is broken?
The first thing is to stop using the National Consumer Price Index as a guide for your personal life. It is a macro tool, like a weather satellite. It can tell you if there is a storm coming to the continent, but it cannot tell you if you need an umbrella in your specific backyard. For your own planning, you have to look at your own basket. There are actually personal inflation calculators online, even some provided by government agencies like the Bureau of Labor Statistics, where you can plug in your own spending in different categories and see how your personal rate compares to the average.
That seems like a great first step. It gives you a sense of where your biggest vulnerabilities are. If your personal inflation is driven by energy, maybe it is time to look at home insulation or an electric vehicle. If it is driven by food, maybe it is time to change where you shop or how you meal plan. It turns a vague sense of everything is expensive into a targeted strategy.
And the second takeaway is to be aware of the lag. When you hear that inflation is coming down, remember that it might take months for that to show up in things like rent or services. Do not make major financial decisions based on a single month's headline number. Look at the trends and look at the components. If core is down but headline is up, that tells you the problem is likely external and volatile, like oil prices. If core is rising, that tells you the inflation is becoming baked into the actual structure of the economy.
And I think there is a broader point here about advocacy. We should be pushing for more transparent and disaggregated data. In an age of big data, there is no reason we should be relying on a single 80-year-old methodology to run the world's largest economy. We need tools that reflect the diversity of the modern experience. We need to stop pretending that a single number can describe the lives of a billionaire in a penthouse and a single mother in a rural town.
I agree. We need to move from the era of the hypothetical basket to the era of real-time, individualized data. It will be messy, and it will challenge our institutions, but it is the only way to rebuild that lost trust. We need to acknowledge that the economy is just a collection of our individual choices and experiences, not some monolithic machine that exists independently of us.
It is a lot to chew on. It really makes you realize that value is not some objective thing out there in the world. It is something we are constantly trying, and often failing, to define and measure. We are using these ancient tools to try and capture the lightning of human desire and necessity.
And that might be the most important lesson of all. The economy is not a machine with fixed parts. It is a living, breathing collection of billions of human choices. Trying to capture all of that in the single percentage point is an impossible task. We should probably stop expecting it to be perfect and start treating it with a healthy dose of skepticism. The basket is not the reality. It is just a very blurry photograph of the reality.
Well said, Herman. I think we have definitely cracked the lid on this one. It is a lot more complex than just a list of groceries. It is about power, policy, and the very way we define what a good life costs.
It really is. And it connects to so many other things we have talked about, like the evolution of human order in episode 816. We have this obsession with categorizing and measuring everything, but sometimes the tools we use become more important than the thing we are trying to measure. We end up serving the metric instead of the metric serving us.
That feels like a perfect place to wrap this up. If you've been listening and you are enjoying these deep dives into the weird machinery of our world, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your podcast app or on Spotify. It genuinely helps other people find the show and keeps us going. We are trying to build a community of people who want to look under the hood of the world.
Yeah, it really does. We love seeing the feedback and hearing what you guys think about these topics. And you can always find our full archive and a way to get in touch at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We have almost 1,000 episodes there now, covering everything from the physics of time to the sociology of the grocery store. If this piqued your interest, there is plenty more to explore.
Episode 999 in the books. Only one more to go until the big 1,000. I can hardly believe it. We've spent a lot of time talking about how the world is measured, Herman.
It has been a wild ride, brother. And thanks again to Daniel for sending in this prompt. It was a great excuse to finally dig into the math of the basket and expose some of those statistical ghosts.
Thanks for listening to my weird prompts. We will be back next time to tackle whatever weirdness comes our way for the big 1,000.
Until then, keep an eye on your own basket. This has been Herman and Korn.
Take care, everyone. Bye for now.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts, that's the close from sloth